Welcome to the Curious Faith Podcast, where today we are going to discuss a question that maybe you've asked before about where Jesus went after he died on the cross. And so we are excited for today's episode, where faith isn't the absence of questions, it's learning where to take them. And so in each episode, we tackle one honest question and seek a biblical, thoughtful answer. My name is Ryan Johnson, and I have a very unique, curious companion for today. In fact, I'm going to let them do their own introduction like I did last week. So who is my curious companion for today?
Hello, folks. Think of me as a friendly, slightly nosy historian of faith, a Bible detective who loves chasing concepts and asking, wait, what do we know? What do we assume? And what might the text actually be saying? I'll poke gently.
And just to let everybody know, are you a real person or who are you?
I'm an AI voice here to help think through the questions with you. Not a person, not a pastor, just a tool you and Ryan can bounce ideas off of.
All right. Well, this is going to be interesting then. So let's jump into today's question, and that is, where did Jesus go from the moment he died until the moment he was resurrected? And I had somebody ask me this question recently, and there are a variety of views that we could go with, but I think the right place to start is Scripture. And so that's where we're going to start. A lot of people might start from the Apostles' Creed, which makes a little bit of a statement about it. But I think probably the best place to go is specifically to the time where Jesus was on the cross, and he was looking at the thief when the thief asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. And Jesus looks at him in Luke 23:43 and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And so there's that question. Okay, what is paradise? What is the the belief that the Jews had in this place called paradise? And my view specifically is that, and trying to combine a few scriptures here that we'll try to go through, that paradise is the place of what we call the righteous dead, and that is this place where Old Testament believers waited for redemption. And so when Jesus died along with the thief, that he went to them, to that place of the righteous dead, and he said basically, hey, all of you were looking forward to the Messiah being sent and accomplishing the atonement once and for all as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so here I am. And then in Ephesians chapter 4, there's this parade. It's, Paul envisions this parade going to heaven at Jesus' ascension. So this is after he was resurrected and after he had spent time with the disciples and he ascended. And it says that he led a host of captives in his train. That was Ephesians chapter 4, verse 8. And the different views of what those captives are. One, those are the demonic realm where Jesus has weakened their forces. And then two, it is that those righteous dead individuals who now are going to out of paradise into the realm of heaven to await for Jesus' second coming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense as one coherent reading. Just to slow it down a touch, you're stacking a few texts together. Luke 23 for paradise, Ephesians 4's captives, and maybe 1 Peter 3 about proclamation. Quick clarifier. When you say paradise, are you picturing it as distinct from heaven proper or ultimately the same?
I would make it distinct from heaven proper because of the idea that the Jews had specifically of going to an eternal, a resting place that was outside of time, and that that Jesus's atonement on earth for sin once and for all was not just the definitive point in human history, but it was the definitive point in redemptive history as well. And so until that point, they were awaiting him. And then after that point, they go and are awaiting his second coming.
That tracks within that framework, yeah. Folks do debate whether paradise is just another way of saying God's presence immediately or a distinct interim state. Your read leans into that interim gathering and then presentation idea, which is a classic view for some. Mind if I nudge one more detail?
Sure, go ahead.
When you mention 1 Peter 3, are you understanding made alive in the Spirit as Jesus personally proclaiming victory in that realm, or is something else entirely?
So you mentioned 1 Peter chapter 3. Let me turn there so that I can respond. So 1 Peter chapter 3, we are looking at the starting in verse 18. 1 Peter 3:18 says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water." And then verse 21 says, "Baptism, which now corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him." Is that right?
Let me check that real quick. Yes, that's the tough passage I was thinking of. People read it a few ways, like a victory proclamation to fallen angels or to human spirits from Noah's time, or even as Christ preaching through Noah back then. Which of those feels closest to what you're describing?
Well, I think the larger context is important. And so the idea of 1 Peter chapter 3 is that there were those in 1 Peter, in the context that Peter's of the church that Peter's writing to, is that they are suffering. They're suffering for following Jesus. They're suffering from the government around them. They're suffering from the Jewish people. They're suffering from those who are just pagans in general. And so that persecution is something that they're having to face and battle. And so verse 17, which is the immediate context of verse 18 before that tough passage, is that it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. And then verse 18 says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous." And then he talks about the spirits in prison and the days of Noah, and that's where you get into the tough passage there. So I think the immediate context is that, Noah preached for decades and decades and decades while the ark was being built, and had to endure the suffering, and basically all of those days where judgment was delayed, where the flood was delayed, was God's patience as Noah proclaimed that the flood was coming. And so I think the reference there, because if we continue to follow the text, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit." And then, once again, that's that they were, because verse 19 and 20 there are the really tough verses there, that I think specifically there's that, is he talking about, in which, meaning that there are spirits who are in prison since the days of Noah, and that's where the view is that it wasn't the righteous dead that Jesus went and proclaimed liberty to, it was actually just the realm of the dead in general. And so, but I think it talks about being made alive in the Spirit, in which, in that same Spirit, just like Noah did in his day, he proclaimed freedom to the people who were already kind of under judgment, because that judgment was coming whether they got on the ark or not. And so Jesus is proclaiming freedom to these people who are under the sentence of death. They've already incurred the judgment of death, that first death, and they are locked in there. But in God's mercy and grace and patience, God sends him to proclaim that the Messiah that they had looked for, the one that God was going to use to redeem them, and that's where they put their faith, he was here, and now they could go with him.
Yeah, and I like where you're bringing it back to the pastoral thread. Encouragement for sufferers, not just a map of the afterlife.
Well, that's
But here's the
Peter's
detective
originally
nudge.
context. I mean, we can't ignore that, right? I mean, you can't strip out that one passage from its context and try to develop a perspective of where Jesus went. Just from
That's a
that,
fair guardrail.
yeah.
Absolutely. Starting with authorial intent is solid. I just want to flag that the language spirits in prison formally disobeyed sounds like a tricky fit for the righteous dead. How do you reconcile that wording with your view? I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think the problem with trying to reconcile it is you are taking a viewpoint that is put together, from several different passages, and you're trying to make it fit. I think if we can't quote unquote make it fit, if we can't make that passage fit, it doesn't necessarily negate the view that I've already shared that Jesus was going to preach to the righteous dead. I think what it does do is it negates some other views that, some people just say that Jesus stayed in the grave. I think there are, once again, that some people who take that word spirits, right? The spirits who are in prison, mean that he proclaimed liberty, I guess, or his victory. He proclaimed that victory to not humans who had died, but spirits, right? And so that in that case, maybe the right viewpoint is when it comes to 1 Peter chapter 3, that the spirits who are imprisoned are ones that God put in prison when what happened with Noah happened because of the heavenly beings who were coming, and they were copulating with human women, and that's what brought about the flood, right? So God imprisoned those spirits, and then Jesus doesn't go to proclaim liberty to them. Jesus goes to them and says, hey, I have conquered. And that's what Ephesians 4 is talking about. Those are the captives, because those spirits who are in prison, now God is taking them, and those captives, Ephesians 4 pictures that parade where the spoils are being thrown out to the church in the form of gifts. And so maybe the whole idea of Jesus robbing the realm of the dead, or this spiritual prison that these demons were in, robbing them, is saying that, hey, the church is going to be victorious, and I am weakening the kingdom of Satan, and one day I will fully destroy it.
I think that's reasonable. Saying this text contributes but doesn't have to bear the full weight is cautious. As your curious historian, I just named for listeners, here are the texts that are clear, and here are the texts that are disputed, so people know which parts of the timeline are in the synthesis rather than explicit. That keeps it honest and still hopeful.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the heart behind this question ultimately is just that curiosity of, okay, where did Jesus go? And I think behind every question about what awaits us in the afterlife, especially after Jesus, is really a personal question about, well, what's going to happen to me? And that's where we've talked about in the past that, what Paul mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 about to be absent with the body is to be present with the Lord, and that, he had experiences where he was caught up into the third heaven. And so you have this, some denominations who believe in a soul sleep. Catholicism, for instance, believing in a purgatory or a limbo. where people go after they die. I think it's very clear that the place that awaits believers who die after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus is the presence of God in that heavenly realm, and that's where we will go after we die. And Jesus made it to where we will not go anywhere else. He has ensured that we will go to that heavenly realm, and so there's no reason to fear for the believer of dying.
Let me take a quick look. That lands strong. And I'd add one quick encouragement. Notice the New Testament doesn't linger on the mechanics nearly as much as it lingers on the promise, right? With me. That's the refrain. The details are debated, but that presence is the steady drumbeat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the promise itself is what we call, the apostolic hope, that either Jesus is going to come again and receive us to himself, or that we will go be with him in heaven. And so that's a really good way to bring our podcast here to conclusion. Thanks to my curious companion, and we are grateful that we've had this opportunity for this episode of the Curious Faith Podcast. And so if today's episode helped you, then share it with a friend who might be asking the same question. And if you've got a question you'd like featured on a future episode, then email us at questions@curiousfaithpodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast is sponsored by Agape Baptist Church. You can learn more about Agape or its outreach ministries through the Community Care Village by visiting our website and seeing how you can get connected. And so until next time, stay curious and keep growing in the faith.